Today, we're working again with changing the world, our small task. The more specific we are, the more agency we have, the more power we have to change things. So, we're going to look at very specifically today how shifting one thing can make a difference, how we shift our energy and shift our focus in the world. We have so much impact in the world that we're in. And sometimes it's something so simple as being kind to a neighbor or a neighbor being kind to us. What kind of a world are we living in, and what kind of a world do we want to live in, and what is our focus? Right now, our focus has been on the US election for many of us. And what does that mean? And how are we going to work within that changed environment? And yet, here we are still with our own personal life and our own personal relationships. We can work on all these different levels. Sherri Mitchell, Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring this back today is because I think there's some very specific insights and instructions that we can work with. So this 80-10-10, I like the concept of it. We really can't change anything in our life, our personal life, our relationships, and in the world until we're able to be present with the truth. The 10% part is to not get bogged down, because it's really easy to go into hopelessness and despair. And I think we've all seen that around many different things. We just kind of get fixated on it and we want to learn more about it. We really care. And yet it just kind of saturates our whole environment. So to put 10% of our time and effort and energy into really looking clearly, this is what the situation is, then limiting it to about 10%. So that willingness to see the truth, I think, has really helped if we know that we're not going to be absorbed in that 50% of the time. If we're going to see it, we're going to be clear about it, and then we're going to go ahead and do something. So the next 10% is to work with harm mitigation. This could be personally, this could be as a community, as a culture. There has been a lot of harm, and there are a lot of things that we can do. If we look at the environment, for instance, there's no question some things really need to be changed and that we can have an impact on that. Part of that impact is getting together with other people and pressuring governments to make changes. And part of it is our own personal reduce, recycle instead of buying new things all the time. To really be conscious of how am I contributing to the harm that's happening, and how can I change or shift what I'm doing to reduce the harm or to help somebody with that. And then also, this 10% is to not get too bogged down. Oftentimes, we get kind of in a trance of looking at what the harm is and on social media feeds and different things. It can be really difficult to tear ourselves away from these two things: what needs to be changed and how can we help. And then 80% to creating this world that we want to live in, and to noticing that we're living in a world that's not a social media world, it's not a news world, it's a personal world. We're in relationship with each other. So if we care about these things, which we do, safety, I mean, that really overrides everything. Our nervous system comes in and goes, no, this is not okay. And we get very anxious often, we get really compulsive. Compassion, equality, justice, and sustainability for everyone, for other beings, and for the earth. I noticed when I was working in the lesbian feminist activism in the 80s and 90s that most of the time we weren't really working on building the kind of community that we wanted to live in. A lot of our focus was on the things that were wrong and that we were trying to address and bring to light. And so that really contributed to burnout, certainly for me and many of my friends who were doing that. We need something positive to sustain us. That's part of where I really like this 80%. Let's focus on what we want to build. In Sherri's book, she talks about the law of attraction in a bit of a different way, energy flow. So any thought or idea that enters our energy field comes in through an existing pattern. So if we were to think, for instance, about friendship and community, and I live near a small village, people are very engaged with each other. People know each other, people have a history with each other. So I'm coming in kind of from the outside. I haven't lived here my whole life. But there's a pattern to the way that people communicate with each other, the way that people think about what's going on in the community. People care very much about what's happening in our community. And so what Sherri's saying is that everything that comes in comes through an existing pattern. So, for instance, I wanted to change something about what's happening in my local community. There is an existing pattern. There are players. Oftentimes, people have a commitment to their ideas and are holding on to grudges and all kinds of things. So, the best way to shift an existing pattern is to enter into its natural flow and then slowly shift it from within. So, that's what I wanted to focus on today, kind of on a personal level, working on perhaps in your community, but also maybe on your friendship. It could be a specific friendship, it could be your pattern. Every current that enters into the flow has an impact on the overall pattern, and that makes sense. It might not have enough of an impact to shift the whole pattern. If we're talking about a personal friendship, it might. We might have had a long-standing friendship with somebody, and all of a sudden they fall in love, and then here's this new current, and it really has an impact on the pattern between us. So we could see that, and then as we get bigger and bigger and more people, most of us have much less of an impact. And then we get down to what our goals are and what our values are. And our conditioning in North American, Western European culture is that we are safest if we have our own success. Actually, the way that human beings evolved was in cooperation. And the reason that we became successful is that we cooperated. And now, with the current system that we're in, that has gotten lost. And we can really see it with the 1% holding almost all of the wealth and power in the world. And the rest of us are in this system that doesn't really work for us. And we saw this in the election in the US too, and we see it everywhere. The people in power will pit us against each other, even though the real person or the real system that's responsible for the wealth inequity is not amongst us. It's between us and the 1%. When we're in this kind of a shift, we need to be clear about what is the pattern, who is actually benefiting from things. And if we want to have this more just world and be a more harmonious, whether it's within our family or our community or our friendships, then we can work together. And we have to see that our success depends on each other. If we're talking really specifically, for instance, about this class, one of the things that happens is that in the small groups in particular, the more regulated everybody is, the deeper the experience is. So one person doesn't get to say everything they want to say and take up the whole half hour. We're cooperating with each other. I know there's a felt sense of that when that's happening. It's like magic. And people have often talked about that. Thank you for my group. You guys were great. So we have this, we know this, and yet that's not what's happening in our conditioning as a culture. The US election really highlighted a lot of things, but it certainly didn't start with that. We have this evolutionary shift that we're interested in, that we want to move to this world where we can feel safer and more connected and enjoy our life and work on some of the things that we need to work on. We are interconnected. So, how can we be as grounded as possible, as wise as possible? The more regulated we are in our nervous system, the more we have access to wisdom. So, we're in this shift and we need to expand our awareness. And that's what we're really doing here. And we're doing it very specifically through looking at some of these concepts and then how can we apply them. We're going to start with choosing a topic, and I'm going to use friendship as an example, whatever resonates for you. And then we're going to look at some of the patterns within that. How can we really see clearly what is the pattern? And then how could I change or shift that pattern? So it might be setting a boundary. It might be being more honest about how you feel about something. It could be all kinds of different things. What is the reality that you'd like to be living in that friendship, or if you're working with the environment or whatever you're working with? Here's the big question. So let's settle into that in our body. These are somatic inquiries, meaning that we're aware of our thoughts in our mind, but also we're aware of the energy, sensations in our body. If you notice as you're going through this that you're starting to get tense through your shoulders, you're holding your breath, that's good information to know. And then we could relax our body and take a few breaths. So, what comes to mind that you would like to work on in this inquiry? And if it's a friendship, one example, somebody who talks all the time and where there's an imbalance in the relationship tends to be, I support the other person and they're discharging a lot, which is understandable. This kind of verbal ventilation or discharge is very helpful to help somebody kind of calm down, but it might not be what we want. What would you like to work with, and what specifically needs to be changed? And then looking at what is the harm that's happened here. So if I look at some of my relationships when I've been in a state of freeze, some of the harm was that I wasn't really available to the other person. And maybe that activated some attachment distress or a feeling of, well, this person doesn't even like me enough to be present here. Maybe it was disappointing to people. Maybe I was reacting to somebody who was discharging a lot, maybe with anger or other things. We're not really looking at blame, just to notice what is the harm, what's happened. One of the ways that we might limit the harm or work with it in this example might be that I might have a conversation with that friend and say, I'm really sorry that over this last period of time, however long that is, I haven't really been able to be here for you because I've been really isolated or scared or afraid or whatever it is. And I've been in a bit of a state of freeze and I haven't really been able to be there for you. And I apologize for that. I'm sorry. So let's look at that. What is the harm? And how might you work with that? And then what kind of a reality would be more satisfying? Safety, compassion, equality, justice, sustainability. Those are big words and concepts, but just in the specific example that you're using, let yourself imagine or visualize what that might look like. In the friendship example, it might be that I make a commitment to sit down and really pay attention when the other person's talking. Or if you're the one who tends to discharge a lot of energy, it might be to listen and to notice I'm feeling that urge to jump in. But actually, I would really like to know what my friend is thinking or feeling. So I'm going to work with staying grounded. I'm going to hold my own hands or whatever that might be. What shifts could you make? These little shifts, some of them are quite dramatic, but a lot of them are attention based. What could you do? And what would that look like in the relationship? Let yourself kind of visualize that, bring it to mind, let yourself feel that. And keep noticing your breath, your body. And it might be possible that what you would like to see isn't possible in this particular situation with this particular person. So it might be broader than the person. It might be, well, I'm going to practice compassion and I'm going to set some boundaries and limit the time I spend. And I'm going to look and see who else is in my world that I could engage with in a different way that would be more equal, that would be more satisfying. What is it that you'd like to bring into your world in terms of friendship or whatever it is that you're working with? What might that look like? What shifts do you need to make in order to help bring that in? And there might be some steps. Maybe if you have social anxiety or if you go into a freeze or into more of an activated state, maybe one of those steps is to really work with nervous system regulation. Maybe a step would be to cultivate compassion for the other person in the friendship. See, there might be several steps here. Usually these things don't change all of a sudden, including ourselves. Often we intend something and then we kind of slip off a bit and then we come back. So notice if there are steps and what those might be. And bring in the wisdom of your heart. What does your heart know about this? Noticing if it's getting too complicated. See if you could bring it back. Just one small thing. It might be a difficult thing, but one thing that you could do, and then imagine how that would flow through and shift the situation that you're in. So we're being clear about what needs to be changed and about the harm. And what is it that we want to have open up here? And how does that feel in your body, in your heart? What does your heart know? Sometimes we can get into a bit of an inner critic or anger at somebody else or at ourselves. See if you can let all of that go just for another couple minutes as we're sitting with this. If I'm showing up as my best self, guided by heart based wisdom, what does that look like? What does that feel like? How would that transform that friendship? Give one more pass through this, just noticing what came up. Was there anything that was kind of surprising? Did you notice any change in your body at different parts of that? Maybe you were thinking, well, this is what I'd really like to do, but then getting kind of hopeless about it. Or maybe I got kind of inspired about that. I really could do that. I could have a conversation, or I could, whatever it was that comes to mind for you, on how you might start to shift this pattern, this energy, and let yourself be aware of the whole picture. Bringing to mind the picture of what it is that we're really wanting to create that's going to be more nourishing and connected and compassionate. To let ourselves feel into that is quite a gift.